Between October 15th and 17th, 1979, 11 people were eliminated across the remote hollows of Pike County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Ginseng Massacre. All adults, all connected to a systematic theft operation targeting wild ginseng beds. The method was surgical: hunting rifles from distance, shotgun ambushes on forest trails, coordinated strikes that left no witnesses. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or drug cartels or federal agents. They were 4 members of the Carson family, a father and his 3 sons, moving through the Cumberland foothills like ghosts, methodically erasing everyone who'd stolen from land their family had worked for 130 years. The Kentucky State Police would later call it one of the most calculated eliminations in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't drugs, wasn't a blood feud passed down through generations, wasn't even revenge for physical violence. It was ginseng, wild American ginseng worth $600 per pound, cultivated in secret forest locations for 40 years, stolen by men who'd once been neighbors. Roots that represented legacy, inheritance, the only thing of value the Carson family possessed in a world where men like them had nothing else. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Pike County, Kentucky, sprawled across 789 square miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain in eastern Appalachia in 1979. The Big Sandy River carved through valleys so deep and narrow that winter sunlight only touched the bottom for 3 hours each day. Population stood around 68,000, down from 92,000 in the coal boom years of the 50s, when King Coal employed every able-bodied man. The county seat, Pikeville, held barely 6,000 souls who knew each other's business, secrets, and grudges, going back generations. October in Pike County meant temperatures dropping to the low 50s at night, creeping up to maybe 70 by mid-afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves, mixed with the sweet rot of fallen leaves, damp earth, and that particular metallic tang of mountain streams running cold over limestone. Morning fog rolled down from the ridges so thick you couldn't see 20 feet ahead on Route 119. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a coal truck grinding up a grade 2 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you on the forest floor. Centuries of leaf litter dampening every footstep. At night, when the temperature really dropped, you could hear the mountains settling, branches creaking under their own weight, owls calling across the hollows, and the distant barking of coonhounds, chained outside trailers, scattered through the hills. But 1979 was a devastating year for coal country. The mining industry that had sustained Pike County for nearly a century was in free fall. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their machinery rusting in the rain. Unemployment hovered around 28%. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking their lives for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps that bought humiliation at the grocery store. In that economic wasteland, some families turned to the oldest Appalachian traditions. Not moonshine, which drew federal attention and required equipment that could be confiscated, but ginseng, wild American ginseng that grew in the deep forest, hidden in the shade of oak and poplar, worth more per pound than gold, legal to harvest on your own land, legal to sell to buyers who shipped it to China and Korea, where it had been prized medicine for thousands of years. The mountains provided everything needed: the right soil composition, the proper elevation, the shade and moisture, and countless hidden hollows where a man could cultivate beds that nobody else knew existed. But there was no legal protection. You couldn't deed wild ginseng, couldn't fence it or guard it every hour. You just had to hope that the old codes held, that mountain people still respected another man's work, that thieves understood there were lines you didn't cross. In 1979, those codes were dying as fast as the coal industry, replaced by desperation and the cold logic of survival that made everything fair game. James Robert Carson was 54 years old that October, though he looked closer to 65. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, but stooped forward from 3 decades spent hunched in coal seams, barely 4 feet high, swinging a pick in darkness that made noon feel like midnight. His face was weathered like old boot leather, deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting into sun and coal dust. A thick scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, souvenir from a roof collapse in 1968 that killed 2 men standing right beside him. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently stained black from coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the damage, the price of every shift worked, every ton of coal loaded. Every morning James woke at 4:45, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at his kitchen table reading 1 chapter from a King James Bible his mother had given him in 1947. He'd read, drink his coffee, black and strong enough to strip paint, then step outside to watch the sun come up over Black Mountain. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Pall Mall rolled so tight it lasted 15 minutes, and then he'd start his day. Check the ginseng beds hidden 2 and 3 miles back in the woods, following trails only he and his sons knew. Test the soil moisture, look for signs of disturbance. Count the plants to ensure none had been taken. By 7:30 he'd be back home, eating breakfast Martha had prepared, planning the day's work. He'd married Martha Louise Jenkins in 1949, right after his discharge from the Army. Korea had given him nightmares and that scar from shrapnel that missed his carotid artery by 2 inches. They'd had 3 boys who'd all grown into men now. Robert Jr. was 29, back from Vietnam with his own nightmares and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer. Michael was 27, quieter than his older brother, but just as capable. Daniel was 24, the youngest, still trying to figure out who he was beyond being James Carson's son. What James valued most wasn't money, though God knew the family needed it with the mine closed and no legitimate work available for 40 miles. What he valued was legacy. His grandfather, Ezekiel Carson, had discovered the first ginseng bed in 1893, back when the mountains were still mostly wilderness and a man could walk for days without seeing another soul. Ezekiel had learned from Cherokee families who'd lived in these hills before forced removal, learned which plants were valuable, how to identify the distinctive palmate leaves, how to harvest without destroying the population. That knowledge had passed from Ezekiel to James's father Samuel, from Samuel to James, an inheritance more valuable than money, because it couldn't be taken by banks or destroyed by economic collapse. The ginseng beds James tended weren't cultivated in the agricultural sense. You couldn't just plant seeds and expect results. Wild ginseng required 7 to 10 years to reach maturity, needed specific soil, pH between 5.5 and 6, required 80 to 90% shade canopy, demanded elevation between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. The roots grew slowly, developing the gnarled, twisted shape that Chinese buyers prized, accumulating the ginsenosides that made the plant valuable as medicine. James had 6 primary beds scattered across 8 square miles of mountain forest. Each bed contained between 200 and 400 mature plants, 7 to 15 years old, representing decades of careful stewardship. The largest bed, hidden in a hollow near the headwaters of Shelby Creek, contained plants his father had originally seeded in 1937. 42 years of growth, roots thick as a man's thumb, worth $15 to $20 each dried. The math was simple and staggering. 6 beds, roughly 1,800 mature plants, average value $12 per root dried. That was $21,600 in the ground, equivalent to 5 years of legitimate wages for a coal miner. Except the mines were closed, and the ginseng was the only asset the family possessed. But there was no legal protection. Ginseng, growing wild on your land, wasn't considered your property under Kentucky law. If someone found it and harvested it, you had no recourse. Couldn't call the sheriff, couldn't sue in court, couldn't prove ownership. The beds were protected only by secrecy and the unwritten code that you didn't steal another man's ginseng. That code had held for generations. But in 1979, with unemployment at 28% and families going hungry, old codes started to feel like luxuries desperate people couldn't afford. The Hensley crew wasn't a gang in any organized sense. They were 11 men, brothers and cousins and associates, bound together by blood relation and economic desperation, rather than criminal hierarchy. Tommy Lee Hensley was 38 years old that fall, built thick and strong with a red beard he kept trimmed close, and hands missing the ring and pinky fingers on the right side lost to a conveyor belt malfunction in 1974. He'd worked in the mines for 18 years before the accident, then tried to make a living doing odd jobs, fixing equipment, scrapping metal from abandoned mine sites. His younger brothers Wayne, Carl, and Bobby worked when they could find it, survived on disability and unemployment when they couldn't. The extended crew included cousins, childhood friends, men who'd grown up in the same hollows, attended the same churches, played basketball together at Pike County Central High School. These weren't career criminals or organized gangsters. They were men who'd lost everything when the mines closed, who watched their families slip deeper into poverty every month while politicians in Washington talked about retraining programs that never materialized and economic development that never reached the mountains. Tommy's father had worked ginseng in the 60s. understood the system. Tommy had learned by watching, had developed his own network of beds, but the profits weren't enough. Not when you had 7 adults to feed and medical bills piling up from that conveyor belt accident the mining company refused to cover because they claimed he'd violated safety protocols. Desperation makes people rationalize things they'd never consider otherwise. If ginseng was just growing in the woods, not on deeded property, not legally owned, then wasn't it fair game for anyone who could find it? That was the logic anyway. The justification that let Tommy sleep at night after he started scouting other families' territories, looking for beds that had been tended for decades, planning to harvest them before the rightful stewards could. His crew followed him because they were family, because they were desperate, because the old codes seemed like relics from a time when there was enough for everyone. But there wasn't enough anymore. There was just survival, and survival meant taking what you could find, even if someone else had planted it, tended it, built their future around it, even if taking it meant crossing a line that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. July and August of 1979 brought unusual heat to the mountains, temperatures climbing into the low 90s by afternoon, humidity so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. James Carson noticed the signs first during his morning rounds on July 23rd. Fresh disturbances in the forest near his oldest bed, broken branches that hadn't been broken the day before, boot prints in soft mud near the creek crossing, cigarette butts that weren't his brand. Someone had been watching, studying, learning the trails. He told his sons that evening, warned them to be vigilant but didn't act immediately. Maybe it was hunters scouting for deer season. Maybe it was hikers from out of town who didn't know better. August brought confirmation. On the morning of September 8th, a Saturday when fog hung so thick James could barely see 50 feet ahead, he discovered the first theft. An entire bed, located in a hollow 3 miles from the homestead, had been stripped. 247 plants that James had counted just 5 days earlier, gone. The ground was torn up where they'd been dug, hastily, carelessly, with no regard for sustainable harvesting. Younger plants destroyed in the rush to get the valuable roots. The math was brutal and immediate. 247 mature plants at an average $12 per root dried meant $2,964 stolen. But it wasn't about the money, not really. Those plants represented 40 years of his family's stewardship. Knowledge passed down through 3 generations, carefully tended through droughts and floods and hard winters. The theft wasn't just economic loss. It was violation of everything James had been taught about respecting another man's work, about the codes that let mountain people coexist in hard times. He spent that day tracking, following the thieves' trail back toward Blackberry Ridge, where the Hensley family had holdings. The trail disappeared on a logging road, but James knew in his bones who'd done it. Knew they'd been watching for weeks, knew they'd be back. September 20th confirmed everything. A second bed, this one near the headwaters of Shelby Creek, discovered harvested. 312 plants gone. Another $3,744 stolen. But more than that, another piece of his family's legacy destroyed. James called his sons together that evening. They sat at the kitchen table, same table where James's father had sat, where his grandfather had sat, and discussed what couldn't be undone. The law wouldn't help. Sheriff Hopkins was a good man, but ginseng theft wasn't considered a priority when people were getting their copper pipes stolen, their equipment taken, their homes broken into. And even if Hopkins wanted to help, what could he prove? Ginseng wasn't deeded property. The Hensleys would deny everything. September 28th fell on a Friday. Temperature 68 degrees by late afternoon. Sky clear and blue in that particular way. Autumn skies get when summer finally breaks. James drove his 1967 Ford pickup into Pikeville to get supplies at Miller's General Store on Main Street. The store had been there since 1923, sold everything from canned goods to kerosene to hunting supplies, operated by the same family for 3 generations. James walked in around 4:15, the bell above the door announcing his arrival, and found Tommy Lee Hensley standing at the counter buying cigarettes. The moment stretched. Tommy turned, saw James, and something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite fear. Something closer to satisfaction. Like he'd been waiting, but this encounter, maybe even wanted it. James walked up to the counter, stood 3 feet from Tommy, and spoke quietly enough that the teenager working the register had to strain to hear. Asked Tommy directly if he'd been on Carson land, if he knew anything about the missing ginseng. Tommy's response came with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Said he didn't know what James was talking about. Said ginseng grew all over these mountains. Said a man couldn't own what grew wild. James pointed out that Tommy's truck, visible through the store window, contained digging tools, a mattock with fresh soil still clinging to the blade, a burlap sack with the distinctive shape of ginseng roots. Tommy shrugged, said he'd been working his own beds. Said James couldn't prove anything different. The teenager at the register looked uncomfortable, pretending to organize cigarette cartons. 2 other customers in the store, local women buying groceries, had stopped to watch. Everyone knew what was happening, understood the subtext, recognized that mountain codes were being violated in real time. James tried once more. Said Tommy knew what he'd taken, knew what it meant, knew there'd be consequences if he didn't make it right. Tommy's smile widened. He leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper meant only for James. Said prove it. Said the mountains were full of ginseng. Said it didn't have James's name carved into the roots. Said times were hard for everyone. Said maybe James should have guarded his beds better. Then Tommy walked out, truck door slamming, engine starting, driving away slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world and nothing to fear. James stood there for 30 seconds, hand on the counter, breathing slow and measured. The teenager asked if he still needed supplies. James said no, walked out, drove home in silence. That evening, September 28th, 1979, James Carson called his 3 sons to the homestead, told Martha to drive to her sister's house in Prestonsburg. Stay the night. Don't ask questions. Martha was 50 years old, her face worn smooth by decades of worry, and she understood immediately, kissed James on the cheek, packed a small bag, left without saying goodbye to her sons. Some things wives didn't need to witness, Didn't need to carry. The four men sat at the kitchen table after she'd gone. Robert Jr., 29 years old, with the 1,000-yard stare he'd brought back from Da Nang. Michael, 27, quieter than his brother but steady, reliable. Daniel, 24, the youngest, still believing there might be other ways. James laid it out plainly, told them about the confrontation at Miller's store, about Tommy's response, about what it meant. The Hensley crew had stolen $26,000 worth of ginseng across 2 raids. They'd been watching the Carson beds, learning the locations, planning to strip them all before winter. The law wouldn't help. The community couldn't help. If they did nothing, the family would lose everything they had left. Not just the money, not just the ginseng. The legacy, the knowledge. The only inheritance James could pass to his sons in a world that had taken everything else. Robert Jr. spoke first. Said he understood, said he was in, said Vietnam had taught him that sometimes violence was the only language desperate people understood. Michael nodded, said less, but his agreement was clear in the set of his jaw, the way his hands lay flat on the table. Daniel struggled, asked if they'd tried talking to Sheriff Hopkins, tried getting the county attorney involved, tried anything besides what James was proposing. James explained patiently. Hopkins couldn't do anything even if he wanted to. Ginseng theft wasn't a crime you could prosecute when ownership couldn't be established. The county attorney was overwhelmed with felonies, wouldn't waste time on civil disputes over plants. And even if they could get the law involved, what then? The Hensleys would be back next year? Or the year after, because word would spread that the Carsons were soft, that you could steal from them without consequences. The choice wasn't between violence and law. The choice was between violence and watching everything their family had built for 130 years disappear into someone else's pockets. No vote was taken. No formal decision made. Just understanding between 4 men who shared blood, land, and the knowledge that some lines, once crossed by others, demanded crossing in return. They talked until midnight, planning, assigning, preparing. Then they went to their separate homes and tried to sleep. September 29th through October 14th represented 16 days of methodical preparation. James approached it with military precision, skills learned in Korea where he'd served as infantry, learned that survival required planning, patience, and the willingness to do what others couldn't. First came reconnaissance. Each Hensley crew member's routine was documented over the next week. Where they lived, where they worked, what times they came and went. Tommy's schedule was easiest to track because he was loud about it, talked at the gas station about his plans, about the money he'd be making come October when ginseng season peaked. His brothers Wayne and Carl worked irregular hours at a logging operation near Robinson Creek. Bobby, the youngest at 22, was taking classes at the community college but spent most evenings at Tommy's property. The extended crew, 7 other men including cousins Marcus Tate, Billy Hensley, Rick Morton, and others, scattered across Pike County but all connected through family and the informal network that Tommy had built. James created maps, noting locations, distances, drive times, identified which Hensley crew members would be easiest to isolate, which would require multiple Carsons working together. Weapons were already owned? No new purchases needed. James had his deer rifle, a Remington 730-06 that he'd bought in 1953. Robert Jr. had his service rifle from Vietnam, kept in violation of regulations, but never reported. Michael owned a 12-gauge shotgun for bird hunting. Daniel had a lever-action Winchester in .30-30, all cleaned, sighted, ammunition counted, and stored. Nothing traceable, nothing that would raise flags with local gun dealers. October 1st through 13th, James read his Bible every morning. Longer than usual? Read passages about righteous anger, about defending what's yours, about Old Testament justice that modern society had tried to soften. He prayed, asking for strength, for precision, for the ability to do what needed doing without becoming the kind of man who killed for pleasure. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection, about legacy, about ensuring his sons had something to inherit. Martha came home October 2nd, saw the rifles being cleaned, saw the maps on the table, said nothing, made meals, washed clothes, went about her daily routine like nothing was different. But she knew. Wives always knew. She just chose not to carry the specific knowledge, chose plausible deniability over complicity. October 14th, Sunday evening, the 4 Carson men gathered one final time, checked weapons, reviewed assignments, synchronized watches. Robert Jr. would handle Billy Hensley, who'd be hunting alone Monday morning. Michael would take Wayne and Marcus if they were together. Daniel would provide backup, mobile response. James would coordinate, handle Tommy personally when the time came. They spoke little, said less. Just preparation, checking, the kind of quiet competence men develop when they have accepted what's coming and refuse to flinch from it. October 15th, 1979, arrived with fog so thick it reduced visibility to 30 feet. Temperature at dawn was 47 degrees, rising slowly as the sun tried to burn through. Robert Carson Jr. woke at 4:30, dressed in hunting clothes he'd worn 100 times, boots he'd waterproofed the night before. He ate breakfast Martha had prepared, scrambled eggs and biscuits, drinking coffee that tasted like metal on his tongue. By 5:15, he was in position, 300 yards from the old fire road where Billy Hensley parked every Monday morning during squirrel season. Billy was 26 years old, married 8 months to a girl named Sarah who worked at the Walmart in Pikeville. Sarah was 3 months pregnant, didn't know yet, wouldn't know until October 20th when she'd take the test and get the positive result that would never matter now. Billy worked part-time at the sawmill in Dorton, made $270 a week when there was work, which wasn't often anymore. He'd joined Tommy's crew because his cousin had asked, because he needed the money, because stealing ginseng seemed like victimless crime when the alternative was watching his young wife worry about bills. Robert heard Billy's truck at 5:47, the distinctive sound of a worn-out muffler echoing through the fog. Watched through the rifle scope as Billy parked, got out, loaded his .22 rifle, started walking the trail toward the ridge. Billy moved carelessly, making noise, not worried about being hunted himself. Robert followed him in the scope, waiting for the right moment, the clear shot, the distance that would make it clean. 230 yards. Billy stopped to light a cigarette, stood in a small clearing where morning light was starting to penetrate the fog. Robert's breathing slowed. Finger on the trigger. Steady pressure. No hesitation. The shot echoed across the hollow, sent birds flying, carried for miles in the still morning air. Billy dropped immediately, killed before his brain could register what happened. Cigarette falling from his lips, body settling among the autumn leaves, like he'd decided to lie down and rest. Robert waited 15 minutes, watching through the scope, ensuring no movement, no witnesses, no complications. Then he walked down, verified the kill, left Billy where he'd fallen, walked back to his truck, parked 2 miles away on a different road, drove home, cleaned his rifle, and sat on his porch, drinking coffee, while the sun burned away the fog. At 11:30 that morning, 2 squirrel hunters found Billy's body and called Sheriff Hopkins from the payphone at Miller's store. October 15th, 1979, unfolded with the kind of terrible momentum that makes hindsight unbearable. By noon, Sheriff Darrell Hopkins stood over Billy Hensley's body in the woods off Route 119, looking at what he hoped was a hunting accident, but suspected was something far worse. Hopkins was 47 years old, had been sheriff for 12 years, knew every family in Pike County and most of their grudges. He'd heard about the confrontation at Miller's store 3 days earlier, had heard Tommy Hensley bragging about his ginseng profits, had seen James Carson's face at the funeral of his father 2 years ago, when they'd buried the last man who'd known where all the original beds were located. Hopkins looked at Billy's body, at the entry wound, at the angle, and knew this wasn't an accident, but proving it would be another matter entirely. The shot could have come from anywhere within 300 yards, and the fog that morning had reduced visibility to nothing. No witnesses, no physical evidence except a single spent casing that told Hopkins the caliber, but nothing about the shooter. He called Kentucky State Police from his radio, requested assistance, started the process that would consume the next 72 hours of his life. Tommy Hensley heard about Billy's death at 2:15 that afternoon when Sarah Hensley's mother called him, hysterical, barely coherent. Tommy drove to the sheriff's office, demanded information, got the basics from Deputy Collins, who was processing paperwork. Billy had been shot once through the chest, high-powered rifle, death instantaneous. No signs of robbery, wallet intact, truck undisturbed. Hopkins told Tommy they were investigating all possibilities, including hunting accident, but Tommy knew immediately. Knew because he'd crossed James Carson, knew because mountain justice worked on different timelines than legal justice, knew because you didn't steal 40 years of a man's work without expecting consequences. Tommy left the sheriff's office at 3:30, drove straight to his property on Blackberry Ridge, called an emergency meeting of his crew. By 4 o'clock, 8 men had gathered in Tommy's garage, surrounded by the tools and equipment of their various trades and crimes. Wayne Hensley, 34 years old, Tommy's brother. 3 children at home. Mining injury disability that paid $420 monthly. Carl Hensley, 31, quieter than his brothers, worked when he could find it. Bobby Hensley, 22, youngest brother. Community college student who'd gotten pulled into the crew by family pressure and economic necessity. Marcus Tate, 31, Tommy's cousin. Navy veteran with PTSD who couldn't hold steady employment. Rick Morton, 33, divorced father paying child support on wages from sporadic construction work. Jimmy Patterson, 28, mechanic at the Ford dealership when they had work. Carl Wilkins, 41, oldest of the crew, had done time in 1973 for theft. Stephen Doherty, 25, newest member, trying to save money to leave Pike County. Tommy told them what he knew, what he suspected, what it meant. James Carson had started a war over ginseng, and Billy was the first casualty but wouldn't be the last. Some argued for going to Hopkins, claiming protection, letting the law handle it. Tommy shut that down immediately. What would they tell Hopkins? That they'd been stealing ginseng, and now the rightful owner was responding? That would put them all in jail for theft, while Carson walked free claiming self-defense of property. Others wanted to scatter, leave Pike County, let things cool down. Tommy refused. Running would make them look guilty, would confirm Carson's victory, would mean abandoning everything they knew for an uncertain future somewhere else. The decision came down to pride, to stubbornness, to Tommy's unshakable belief that you didn't back down from threats, even when those threats came with rifles and the willingness to use them. They'd fortify the property, stay armed, move in groups, wait for Carson to make a mistake. What Tommy didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that James Carson didn't make mistakes. He'd spent 2 weeks planning every detail, anticipating every response, preparing for exactly this kind of defensive posture. 4:15 that same afternoon, Wayne Hensley and Marcus. Tate drove Wayne's pickup truck to check on equipment they'd stored near an abandoned strip mine off Rockhouse Creek. They were together because Tommy had instituted a buddy system after Billy's death. Nobody traveling alone, everyone armed. Wayne carried a 9mm pistol in his waistband. Marcus had a revolver in the glove compartment. Neither weapon would matter. Michael Carson had been watching that strip mine since noon, had known from his reconnaissance that Wayne and Marcus stored equipment there, had predicted they'd come to check it after Billy's death, after the crew went on alert. Michael was positioned 200 yards away, behind an old mining structure, had clear line of sight to where the truck would park, had his 12-gauge loaded with double-aught buckshot for the close-range work that rifles couldn't handle effectively. Wayne parked at 437. Both men got out, walked toward the storage container. Michael waited until they were together. Within 40 yards, optimal range for the shotgun pattern. The first shot caught Wayne in the upper chest and throat, killed him before he could draw his pistol, before he could shout warning. Marcus turned at the sound, tried to run, made it 3 steps before the second shot caught him in the back, severed his spine, dropped him face down in the dirt. Michael approached carefully, verified both kills, found Wayne's wallet with pictures of his 3 children, ages 8, 6, and 4, found Marcus's dog tags from the Navy, discharge papers in the truck showing honorable service, psychiatric evaluation, recommending treatment for combat-related trauma. Michael stood there for 30 seconds, looking at what he'd done, feeling nothing and everything simultaneously. Then he walked back to his truck, drove home, cleaned his shotgun. The bodies weren't discovered until 8:30 the next morning when Rick Morton drove out looking for his crew members who'd never come home. October 16th began with the kind of fear that changes communities permanently. By 9 o'clock that morning, 3 Hensley crew members were dead, and Pike County understood This wasn't random violence or tragic accidents. This was systematic elimination, methodical and unstoppable. The kind of mountain justice that older residents remembered from their grandparents' stories, but thought had died with the previous century. Sheriff Hopkins stood in his office at 10:15, looking at maps, looking at names, doing the math that led to only one conclusion. 3 dead, all connected to Tommy Hensley, all killed within 18 hours, all by different weapons and methods. This was coordination, planning, execution in both senses of the word. Hopkins called Kentucky State Police Headquarters in Frankfort, requested immediate assistance, explained the situation with the kind of careful language that conveyed urgency without triggering federal intervention. FBI involvement would come eventually, but Hopkins wanted to handle this as local jurisdiction as long as possible, wanted to preserve some measure of mountain protocol, even as that protocol was collapsing into bloodshed. State Police Captain Frank Morrison arrived at 1:30 that afternoon with 6 troopers, established a command post, started interviewing witnesses and family members. But everyone in Pike County knew the fundamental problem. Proving James Carson was responsible required evidence, witnesses, someone willing to testify. Mountain communities didn't produce witnesses, especially when the violence followed codes that most residents understood even if they didn't approve. Carson had been wronged, had responded according to old rules, and now everyone was waiting to see how far he'd go, whether he'd stop at some point, or whether this would become the kind of massacre that defined a place forever. Tommy Hensley gathered what remained of his crew at 2 o'clock that afternoon. 8 men now, down from 11. Everyone armed and increasingly panicked. Bobby wanted to run, said they should drive to Lexington or Cincinnati, disappear into cities where mountain feuds couldn't reach them. Carl agreed, said pride wasn't worth dying for. But Tommy refused, and his refusal carried the weight of leadership, family hierarchy, and the stubborn Appalachian conviction that running was worse than dying. They'd stay together, fortify his property on Blackberry Ridge, force Carson to come to them if he wanted to finish this. Tommy's property consisted of 40 acres, main house where he lived, 2 trailers where Wayne and Carl had stayed, workshop that doubled as garage, 8 men, adequate weapons, defensive position. If Carson came, they'd be ready. What Tommy failed to understand was that defensive positions only worked when your enemy attacked predictably, when military logic applied, when you had supply lines and reinforcements and the luxury of waiting out a siege. James Carson wasn't military anymore. He was something older, something the mountains had created long before armies had names, operating on principles that didn't appear in tactical manuals. He didn't need to storm the property. He just needed to wait for darkness, for fear to erode discipline, for men to make mistakes, born from exhaustion and terror. October 16th, 7:30 that evening, James met with his sons at the homestead one final time, discussed what remained, what needed to happen, how to minimize risk while ensuring completion. Robert Jr. advocated for patience, picking them off one by one over weeks, wearing them down psychologically. Daniel argued for stopping, said 3 deaths had made the point, said continuing would only bring more law enforcement attention. Michael said nothing, waiting for his father's decision. James listened to both positions, understood their merits, rejected them both. Patience allowed the Hensley crew to adapt, to bring in outside help, to potentially flee and retaliate later. Stopping now left 5 witnesses, 5 men who could testify, 5 threats to his son's futures. The only logical course was completion, finishing what he'd started before state police could establish surveillance, before federal authorities arrived with resources Pike County couldn't match. The decision was made over instant coffee at the kitchen table. 4 men discussing mass murder with the same calm deliberation they'd used to plan a barn raising. They'd move tonight, hit the property around 10 o'clock when darkness was complete, visibility reduced to nothing for defenders, but Carson's knew the terrain from previous reconnaissance. Weapons checked one final time, ammunition counted, assignments confirmed. Robert Jr. would take the northeast approach, elevated position for rifle work. Michael would cover the southern exposure, shotgun range for anyone fleeing that direction. Daniel would maintain mobility, respond to complications, provide support wherever needed. James would coordinate from the western approach, handle direct confrontation with Tommy if opportunity arose. No discussion of morality, legality, consequences. Those considerations had ended the moment Tommy smiled at Miller's store, the moment he'd refused to acknowledge theft, the moment he'd chosen pride over restitution. Now there was only completion, ensuring the Carson family's legacy survived even if the cost was measured in blood and decades of imprisonment. They finished their coffee, cleaned their cups, and prepared for what would later be called the Blackberry Ridge Massacre, the night that would end 11 lives and define Pike County for generations. October 16th, 1979. 10 o'clock came with new moon darkness so complete that men 5 feet apart couldn't see each other without artificial light. Temperature had dropped to 41 degrees, cold enough that breath condensed in visible clouds, sound carried differently in the dense air. The Hensley property sat on a plateau at 2,400 feet elevation, accessible by a single gravel road that wound up through scrub pine and oak. Tommy had positioned 2 men on the road as sentries, Rick Morton and Jimmy Patterson, both armed with deer rifles, both scared but trying to project confidence they didn't feel. The remaining 6 men stayed in the main house, lights on, windows covered with blankets to prevent silhouettes, weapons within reach. They'd been there since 4 o'clock, eating cold sandwiches, drinking coffee, telling jokes nobody laughed at, waiting for something to happen, or for dawn to arrive and prove they'd survived another night. At 10:15, Daniel Carson cut the power lines a quarter mile down the mountain, used wire cutters on 3 separate runs to ensure no quick repairs. The lights inside the house went dark instantly, followed by shouts, confusion, the sound of men stumbling in sudden blackness, fumbling for flashlights. 30 seconds later, Daniel cut the phone lines, severing the property's only connection to outside help. This was pre-cell phone era, pre-internet, pre-any communication system that didn't rely on physical wires running through forest that the Carsons controlled. Rick Morton, stationed at the road entrance 300 yards from the main house, heard the commotion, saw the lights go out, understood immediately what was happening. He stood from his position behind a fallen log, shouted toward the house, started moving toward the buildings to warn the others. Robert Carson Jr., positioned in a tree stand 240 yards northeast, had been watching Rick through a scope equipped with starlight amplification, borrowed from his Vietnam kit. The shot was a whisper in the darkness, suppressed rifle making less sound than Rick's body hitting the gravel. Jimmy Patterson, stationed 50 yards further up the road, heard something, called Rick's name, got no answer, moved toward Rick's position, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other, making himself an illuminated target that Robert tracked easily. Second shot, second body, both men dead within 90 seconds of the power going out. Inside the main house, Tommy Hensley tried to maintain control. Ordered everyone away from windows, flashlights off, weapons ready. Tried to use a battery-powered radio to call for help. Found only static because the radio was CB and required someone listening on the other end, and nobody was listening at 10:30 on a Tuesday night in October. Stephen Doherty, 25 years old, newest crew member, made the decision that would cost him his life. Said he was leaving, said his truck was parked behind the workshop, said he'd rather take his chances running than wait to die trapped in a house. Tommy tried to stop him, but Stephen pushed past, opened the back door, ran into darkness. Michael Carson, positioned 80 yards south with 12-gauge loaded with buckshot, had predicted someone would run. Let Stephen get 30 feet from the house, far enough that muzzle flash wouldn't immediately reveal Michael's position. The shotgun blasts lit up the night for a fraction of a second, sent Stephen tumbling forward, dead before he hit the ground. 5 men left inside the house now, listening to Stephen's death, understanding that every exit was covered, every escape attempt would end the same way. Bobby Hensley, 22 years old, youngest of the crew, started crying. Said he wanted to go home. Said he was sorry. Said he didn't want to die for ginseng. Carl Wilkins, 41, oldest and most experienced, tried to organize a defense. Said they'd fortify rooms, wait for dawn, hope that state police would notice missing men and investigate. But hope wasn't a strategy, and everyone knew it. At 11:20, the smell reached them first. Smoke, wood smoke, coming from multiple directions. James Carson had circled the property, placed accelerant-soaked rags against the workshop's dry wood siding, lit them simultaneously at 4 points. The workshop caught fast, flames climbing the walls, spreading to the nearby trailer where Wayne had lived before his death. The fire created light, terrible and revealing, casting shadows that made the night worse than the darkness had been. Tommy made the decision then, the only decision left. Said they'd surrender, walk out with hands raised, take their chances with the law rather than burn or get shot picking them off one by one. Carl agreed, said anything was better than this. They opened the front door, 5 men, hands overhead, weapons left inside, shouting that they were unarmed, that they were giving up. James Carson, positioned 60 yards away with clear line of sight, watched them emerge. Watched Tommy Hensley, the man who'd smiled at Miller's store, who'd refused to make restitution, who'd stolen 40 years of Carson family work and called it fair. Watched Carl Wilkins, who'd done time for theft once before and never learned. Watched Bobby Hensley, youngest brother, barely more than a kid, crying openly now. Watched Marcus's brother-in-law, whose name James didn't know, whose story James didn't care about. And James made the choice that would define him, that would cost him his freedom, that would prove the only thing worse than letting thieves escape was becoming the kind of man who kills surrendering enemies. He fired first. 1 shot, Tommy in the chest, dead before he hit the porch. Robert Jr. fired second, Carl Wilkins spinning from the impact, falling across Tommy's body. Michael fired third and fourth. The two remaining men, Bobby and the unknown cousin, both trying to run back inside, both dying in the doorway, bodies blocking the entrance. 5 men dead in 8 seconds, the fire growing behind them. The night silent except for flames, consuming wood, and the sound of empty shell casings hitting stone. The fire spread faster than James had anticipated. Workshop fully engulfed by 11:45, flames jumping to the main house despite the distance, dry October air and wood construction combining into inevitable conflagration. Inside the main house, trapped by their dead at the doorway, were 2 men James hadn't counted, hadn't known about. Jake Morrison, 35 years old, mechanic from Elkhorn City who'd joined the crew just the week before, and Dale Hensley, Tommy's cousin who'd arrived that afternoon from Prestonsburg. Both had stayed back when the others surrendered, maybe suspecting what would happen, maybe just paralyzed by fear. Now they listened to the gunfire, smelled the smoke, felt the heat building, and faced the choice no human being should have to make. Die in fire or die by bullet. Because surrender clearly wasn't an option the Carsons were offering. The house fire reached critical temperature at 12:05, flames eating through the roof, smoke making breathing impossible. Jake Morrison made the decision first. Kicked out a back window, climbed through, started running toward the tree line 80 yards away. Made it 40 feet before Robert Carson's rifle found him. 1 shot to the upper back, killed him mid-stride. Dale Hensley watched Jake fall, understood there was no escape, chose fire over bullet. His body would be found later, burned beyond recognition, in what remained of the house's interior, dental records required for identification. The Carsons maintained their positions until 1:30 in the morning, ensuring no survivors, no witnesses, no complications. Watched the buildings burn, reducing to skeletal frames and ash, erasing evidence and lives simultaneously. At 1:45, James gave the signal. They withdrew simultaneously, moved through the forest using trails they'd memorized, reached their vehicles, parked on different logging roads, miles apart, drove home separately. Robert Jr. arrived at his trailer at 2:30, stripped off his clothes, burned them in a barrel behind his property, showered in water so hot it left his skin red. Michael reached his house at 2:40, sat on his porch, despite the cold, smoked 3 cigarettes, watched the stars, and wondered what kind of man he'd become. Daniel got home at 3:15, found his girlfriend asleep, stood in the doorway watching her breathe, memorizing her face because he knew everything was about to change. James returned to the homestead at 3:30, found Martha awake at the kitchen table, Bible open but unread. She looked at him, saw confirmation in his eyes, said nothing. Some things didn't need words. She made coffee. He sat. They waited for dawn together. October 17th arrived with smoke visible for miles. Thick black column rising from Blackberry Ridge that volunteer fire department spotted at 6:15. They called it in, dispatch notified Sheriff Hopkins at 6:45. He called state police at 700. Captain Morrison and 6 troopers reached the site at 8:30, found devastation that made hardened investigators pause. Bodies scattered across the property, some burned, some shot. Evidence of systematic execution that went beyond family feud into something darker. Morrison counted 11 total, called FBI 900, secured the scene, started the investigation that would dominate regional news for the next 6 months. By 10 o'clock, Morrison had reached the same conclusion Hopkins had known since Billy Hensley died 48 hours earlier. James Carson was responsible, his sons had helped, and proving it would be straightforward because Carson wouldn't run, wouldn't hide, wouldn't deny what he'd done. Mountain justice didn't require anonymity. It required that everyone knew who'd exacted it, understood why, accepted that old codes still mattered even in 1979. Sheriff Hopkins drove to the Carson homestead at 2:15 that afternoon, state police following, FBI agents joining from the Pikeville field office. Found James sitting on his porch, coffee cup in hand, watching them arrive with the calm of a man who'd finished his work and accepted the consequences. Hopkins asked him directly, by the book, if he'd been involved in the deaths of 11 men on Blackberry Ridge. James said yes without hesitation, said they'd stolen from him, said he'd asked them to make it right, said they'd refused. Hopkins read him his rights, cuffed him, asked about his sons. James said they'd acted under his direction, said any legal consequences should fall on him alone, said mountain law had always held fathers responsible for family actions. Robert Jr., Michael, and Daniel were arrested within the hour, all at their respective homes, none resisting, all silent except to confirm their identities. Ballistics would prove their involvement anyway. Gunpowder residue tests, forensic evidence that linked each Carson to specific deaths. But the evidence almost didn't matter because none of them denied it. They'd done what mountain codes demanded, protected what was theirs, eliminated threats to their family's legacy. That the law called it murder was irrelevant. They'd crossed a line knowing they couldn't cross back. And now they'd pay the price without complaint, without regret, with the same quiet certainty that had carried them through planning, execution, and aftermath. Pike County would remember this night forever, would tell the story to grandchildren, would debate whether James Carson was hero or monster or somehow both simultaneously, would struggle to reconcile the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the line between justice and murder disappears entirely, leaving only blood and questions and families destroyed on both sides of an equation that never balanced. The arrest of James Carson and his 3 sons sent shockwaves through Pike County that rippled outward into the national consciousness by October 19th, 1979. Media descended on Pikeville like locusts, satellite trucks from Louisville, Lexington, even Cincinnati and Charleston parked outside the courthouse where the 4 men were being held without bond. CNN sent a crew, their coverage framing the story as Appalachian justice collides with modern law, complete with interviews with locals who split roughly 50-50 on whether the Carsons were murderers or men pushed too far by circumstances beyond their control. The Pike County Detention Center, built in 1958 to hold 20 inmates, now housed 4 men who'd become instant symbols of everything America didn't want to examine too closely about rural poverty, economic abandonment, and the codes that filled the vacuum when legal systems failed. James Carson sat in his cell reading the same Bible his mother had given him in 1947, marking passages about justice and vengeance and the difference between them. Robert Jr. exercised compulsively, push-ups and sit-ups, until exhaustion made sleep possible. Without nightmares, adding Carson faces to the Vietnamese ones already haunting him. Michael wrote letters to his girlfriend explaining what he'd done and why. Letters she'd never send, because the prosecution would use them as evidence. Daniel, youngest at 24, struggled most with what they'd become, spent hours staring at the ceiling, wondering if there'd been another way, knowing there hadn't been, but needing to believe otherwise. The funerals began October 22nd and continued through October 27th, 11 services across 5 days. Pike County burying its dead in the same cemeteries where Carson's and Hensley's and Morton's had been buried for generations. Tommy Hensley's service drew 200 mourners, his widow Rebecca barely able to stand, supported by family members who alternated between grief and rage. Wayne Hensley left behind his wife Angela and 3 children who'd now grow up without their father, without his disability income, without anything except Social Security survivor benefits. That wouldn't cover rent. Carl Hensley's funeral was smaller, quieter, attended mostly by extended family, who'd always known Carl was following Tommy into trouble but couldn't stop him. Bobby Hensley's service broke hearts. 22 years old, his mother Patricia collapsing at the graveside, screaming questions at a sky that offered no answers about why her youngest son had died over plants growing in the forest. Marcus Tate's Navy veteran burial included full honors, flag folded and presented to his mother Eleanor, who'd already buried his father in Vietnam, who'd thought her son surviving the war meant he'd survived everything. Rick Morton's daughter, 7 years old, asked why Daddy wasn't coming home, asked when she'd see him again, asked questions that made adults turn away, because there were no good answers for a child trying to understand that revenge costs more than anyone intends to pay. Billy Hensley's wife, Sarah, discovered she was pregnant October 20th, 3 days after learning her husband was dead, joy and grief colliding in a way that destroyed her ability to process either emotion properly. She'd named the baby William after his father, raise him alone on wages from Walmart and survivor benefits, tell him stories about a man he'd never meet, while carefully omitting the part about theft and consequences and choices that seemed reasonable until they weren't. Jimmy Patterson's mother buried her only child October 24th, stood at the graveside remembering the boy who'd loved motorcycles and bluegrass music, trying to reconcile those memories with the man who'd died holding a rifle on a dark road. Carl Wilkins had no family at his funeral, except a sister from Ohio who hadn't spoken to him in 8 years, who came out of obligation and left, wondering if she should feel guilty for the relief that he was gone, that his chaos couldn't touch her life anymore. Stephen Doherty's parents buried their son October 26th, remembered his plans to leave Pike County, to go to trade school in Lexington, to escape the cycles of poverty and poor decisions that had defined Appalachian life for generations. Jake Morrison's ex-wife brought their daughter to his funeral, 7 years old, the same age as Rick Morton's daughter, 2 little girls in matching black dresses who'd grow up with fathers, reduced to photographs and stories, carefully edited to remove the circumstances of their deaths. Dale Hensley's funeral was last, October 27th. sparsely attended because he'd been from Prestonsburg, and most Pike County residents had never met him, had no connection except that he died in their county during an event that they'd be explaining to outsiders for decades. The legal machinery ground forward with the inevitability of a coal train on a downhill grade. FBI involvement brought federal charges potential, civil rights violations, conspiracy to commit murder, weapons charges that carried mandatory sentences. But federal prosecutors ultimately decided to let Kentucky handle it, state murder charges being sufficient and avoiding the complications of proving the Hensley crew's civil rights had been violated when they'd been actively engaged in theft. The Pike County Commonwealth Attorney Douglas Maynard, 49 years old, veteran of 30 years prosecuting crime in eastern Kentucky, took the case, knowing it would define his career and divide his community, regardless of outcome. He brought charges of first-degree murder against all four Carsons, 11 counts each, 44 murder charges total. First degree because the planning, the reconnaissance, the coordination proved premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys arrived from Lexington, experienced criminal lawyers who took the case, knowing it was unwinnable by conventional standards, but recognizing it as the kind of moral dilemma that could establish legal precedent. They'd argue defense of property cultural tradition, systematic failure of legal protections, diminished capacity due to economic desperation, arguments that sounded reasonable in theory but collapsed when confronted with 11 bodies, 5 of them killed while surrendering, 2 of them shot while fleeing, all of them eliminated with the kind of military precision that contradicted any claim of passion or temporary insanity. Jury selection began March 3, 1980. Took 3 weeks because finding 12 Pike County residents without opinions about the case proved nearly impossible. The trial itself lasted 9 weeks, prosecution presenting overwhelming physical evidence, ballistics matching Carson weapons to specific victims, gunpowder residue on Carson hands and clothing, testimony from state police investigators who'd reconstructed the timeline with forensic precision. Defense presented character witnesses, community members testifying about the Carsons' reputation, about the importance of ginseng to Appalachian economy, about the systematic theft that had triggered the violence. Expert witnesses explained the cultural context. Anthropologists and sociologists describing mountain justice traditions. Economists detailing the poverty that made ginseng theft seem like victimless crime, to perpetrators an existential threat to victims. The jury heard it all, saw photographs of bodies, listened to widows crying, watched James Carson sit impassively taking notes, and struggled with the impossible task of reconciling law with justice, legal definitions with moral complexity, the clear fact of guilt with the uncomfortable understanding of motive. Deliberations lasted 4 days, jurors requesting repeated reviews of testimony, asking questions about legal definitions of self-defense and whether defense of property could justify lethal force. The answer legally was no. Defense of property alone could never justify killing 11 men, but morally, the jury remained divided in ways that prevented quick consensus. The verdict came May 27, 1980, 7 months after the massacre, the courthouse packed with media, family members, community residents who'd followed every day of testimony. Guilty on all counts for all 4 defendants. First-degree murder times 11. the jury unable to find legal justification despite understanding the human motivations. Sentencing came June 15th after pre-sentencing investigations, psychological evaluations, victim impact statements that made even hardened court personnel weep. James Carson received life without possibility of parole, 11 consecutive sentences, ensuring he'd die in prison. Robert Carson Jr. received life with possibility of parole after 25 years, judge acknowledging his military service and combat trauma as mitigating factors. Michael Carson received 35 years, parole eligible after serving 85%. Daniel Carson, youngest and least involved, received 25 years, judge noting his minimal participation and genuine remorse. Martha Carson sat through sentencing, holding her daughter-in-law's hand, watching her husband and sons taken away in chains, understanding she'd lost everything. The men she loved, the land that would be seized to pay legal fees and civil judgments, the legacy that was supposed to last generations. She'd live another 28 years, die in 2008 in a nursing home in Prestonsburg. Her obituary making no mention of the massacre, her grave unmarked except for a simple stone bearing her name and dates, as if she could be separated from the events that defined her family's final chapter. James Carson was transferred to Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville on July 2, 1980, beginning a sentence that would last until his death 17 years later. He never spoke publicly about the massacre, granted no interviews, wrote no memoirs. Fellow inmates reported he was quiet, kept to himself, read his Bible daily, worked prison jobs without complaint. He refused parole hearings because his sentence had no parole possibility, but even if it had, other inmates said he wouldn't have participated. James Carson had made his choice, accepted his fate, and spent his remaining years in the kind of stoic acceptance that characterized men raised in circumstances where complaining changed nothing. He died March 14th, 1997, age 71, of lung cancer that had metastasized from decades of coal dust exposure and unfiltered cigarettes. Prison medical care had been minimal, pain management inadequate, but James never complained about that either. His body was returned to Pike County, buried in the family cemetery on land that technically no longer belonged to Carson's, but that the new owners allowed out of respect or perhaps fear of what refusing might mean. Fewer than 20 people attended his funeral, mostly distant relatives, no media, no public acknowledgement of the man whose actions had defined Pike County's darkest chapter. Martha came, 70 years old, stooped and gray, stood at the graveside for 5 minutes, said nothing, left. She never visited his grave again. Robert Carson Jr. served 26 years, released in 2006 at age 55, a gray-haired man who moved slowly and spoke rarely. Prison had been harder on him than his father. The violence, triggering Vietnam memories that medication could only partially control. He worked prison maintenance for 2 decades, learned HVAC repair, earned his GED because his attorney had convinced him education might help at parole hearings. His first parole request in 2005 was denied. Victim families testifying against release. Commonwealth attorney arguing he remained dangerous. Second request in 2006 succeeded. Narrow vote by the parole board, released with conditions including mandatory therapy, restricted travel, regular check-ins. With parole officer, Robert moved to a small town outside Lexington, worked at a commercial HVAC company, lived alone in a trailer, spoke to no one about his past. Co-workers knew he'd done time, but not why, and Robert preferred it that way. He attended Vietnam veteran support groups occasionally, sat quietly, while others shared stories, never mentioning that his nightmares included Appalachian faces as well as Vietnamese ones. He died in 2012, age 61, heart attack while eating breakfast at a diner, slumped over scrambled eggs, gone before paramedics arrived. His obituary listed military service and surviving siblings, made no mention of 1979, was published in the Lexington paper, but not in Pike County, where his name remained synonymous with the massacre. Michael Carson served 29 years, released in 2014 at age 56, physically broken by decades of incarceration, but mentally sharper than his older brother had been. Michael had used prison time differently, earned multiple vocational certifications, took correspondence courses in business management, prepared for a future he wasn't certain he'd reach. Parole came on his third attempt, board members noting his extensive rehabilitation efforts, lack of disciplinary infractions, genuine remorse expressed during hearings. Released to a halfway house in Frankfurt, found work as warehouse supervisor, eventually moved to a small apartment, began the slow process of rebuilding a life that had been paused at 27. Michael reconnected with his old girlfriend who'd married someone else, divorced, now worked as a nurse in Frankfurt. They'd meet for coffee occasionally, careful friendship that acknowledged shared history without trying to resurrect what prison had killed. Michael attended church regularly, Methodist congregation that knew his story, but chose grace over judgment, gave him community without demanding explanation. He volunteers now at a food bank, sponsors prison ministry programs, speaks occasionally to at-risk youth about consequences and choices and the impossibility of taking back violence once committed. He's 67 now, still alive, still carrying the weight of October 1979, still waking some mornings, unable to breathe from the memory of what his hands have done. Daniel Carson served 19 years, released in 2004 at age 43, youngest of the brothers but perhaps most damaged by imprisonment. Daniel had been 24 when arrested, still forming his identity, still believing the world made sense. Prison had destroyed those illusions, replaced them with hard knowledge about what humans do to each other when society's veneer cracks. He was released to a halfway house in Louisville, worked construction for 3 years, saved money, then disappeared, changed his name legally, moved west, last known address in Oregon, though rumors place him in Washington or Northern California. He cut contact with all family, never visited his father's grave, never responded to Michael's attempts at communication. A private investigator hired by a journalist in 2009 found him working as a carpenter in Eugene, Oregon, living under the name David Collins, unmarried, no children, no criminal record, no social media presence. The investigator respected his privacy, never published the location, never revealed what the Carson brother, who'd participated least but suffered most, had become. Daniel, or David, or whatever name he uses now, remains a ghost, a man trying to outrun a night in October when he was too young to refuse his father, too loyal to run, too human to escape the consequences. Martha Carson lived in a small apartment in Prestonsburg after losing the homestead to legal fees and civil judgments. The Hensley families sued in civil court, wrongful death claims totaling $11 million, far more than the Carsons possessed, but the judgment allowed seizure of all assets. The land sold at auction in 1982 for $87,000, far below market value, but nobody wanted property associated with the massacre. The ginseng beds, 40 years of cultivation, were destroyed during the investigation. State police collecting plants as evidence, never returning them, letting them rot in evidence storage while appeals dragged through courts. Martha worked as cashier at a Piggly Wiggly, then as home health aide when retail jobs disappeared, lived on Social Security after 65, existed rather than lived. She visited her husband in prison once monthly until his death, never missed a visit despite the 4-hour drive, sat across from him in visiting rooms and communicated more through silence than words. After James died, she visited Robert until his release, then Michael, maintaining family connection, even when family had been scattered across the penal system. She died February 11, 2008, age 80, pneumonia complications, found by a home health worker who'd come for a scheduled visit. She left no estate, no significant possessions, no explanation for why she'd stayed in eastern Kentucky when she could have left, could have moved to Ohio where her sister lived, could have escaped the whispers and the weight of being Martha Carson. Perhaps she stayed because leaving felt like betrayal, or perhaps she stayed because the mountains were home, and home means something even when it's been soaked in blood and regret. The physical sites of the massacre underwent their own transformations, places absorbing violence and carrying it forward in ways that made locals avoid them without articulating why. The Carson homestead, seized and sold, changed hands 3 times between 1982 and 2004, each owner staying less than 5 years before selling at a loss. The house James's grandfather built in 1893, that had sheltered 4 generations, fell into disrepair under absentee ownership, roof collapsing in a winter storm 2009, walls following in 2013. Today it's just a foundation overgrown with kudzu and poison ivy, occasional teenagers claiming it's haunted, parents warning children to stay away, not because of ghosts, but because of what the ruins represent. The ginseng beds, once worth tens of thousands of dollars, were never replanted. The locations remained secret, known only to Carsons, and they took that knowledge to prison. Forest has reclaimed the sites, mountain laurel and rhododendron growing, where carefully cultivated ginseng once thrived, erasing 40 years of stewardship, as completely as the massacre erased the family that maintained them. Occasionally, hikers stumble across clearings that feel different, where plant diversity seems reduced, where something about the soil composition suggests human intervention decades ago. But nobody knows to look for ginseng anymore. And even if they did, the plants are long gone, legacy destroyed as thoroughly as the family that protected it. The Hensley property on Blackberry Ridge was bulldozed in 1995, county decision following years of complaints about the ruins, about teenagers using the site for parties, about the psychological weight of leaving massacre evidence visible. The foundation was excavated, contaminated soil removed, Entire site graded and covered with topsoil. Today it's an empty clearing where nothing grows quite right. Locals claiming the soil is too acidic, but biologists who've tested it find nothing unusual. More likely it's perception, the human tendency to see physical manifestations of moral trauma, to believe that ground soaked in blood somehow remembers. The clearing sits empty, no developer willing to build, no family willing to buy, just 12 acres of useless land that Pike County holds for back taxes nobody will ever pay because nobody wants it. Hunters avoid it during deer season, even though the elevation and oak coverage make it optimal habitat. Hikers bypass it, even though trails would be easier to maintain in open space rather than dense forest. The land itself has become a memorial, not through plaques or official designation, but through communal avoidance, through the silent agreement that some places should remain empty as acknowledgement of what happened there. Pike County's population has continued declining, 68,000 in 1979 down to 58,000 today. Young people leaving for cities where coal dust doesn't settle on everything, where economic opportunities extend beyond disability checks and service jobs paying minimum wage. The massacre accelerated that exodus, families deciding they didn't want their children growing up in a place defined by violence over plants, where old codes superseded law, where desperation could transform neighbors into executioners. Schools closed, consolidating into larger districts, buildings abandoned and repurposed or demolished. The coal industry never recovered, occasional surface mining continuing, but underground operations mostly ceased. Mountains scarred by strip mining that leaves landscapes looking lunar, destroyed for coal that's no longer economically viable. Ginseng remains legal to harvest. Prices higher now than in 1979. $800 to $1,000 per pound for wild roots. But fewer people work the trade, partly because cultivated ginseng from farms has reduced market demand for wild, partly because younger generations don't know the forest like their grandparents did, but mostly because the Carson massacre poisoned the practice, made people associate ginseng with blood, made the woods feel haunted by choices that couldn't be unmade. The children of the massacre, those 19 kids, left fatherless, grew up in the shadow of October 1979 in ways that shaped their entire lives. Some fled Pike County as soon as they were old enough, changing names, cutting ties, trying to outrun association with fathers who'd been killed in a massacre over theft. Others stayed carrying names like Hensley and Morton and Patterson with defiant pride, refusing to be driven from their homes by shame or judgment. Billy Hensley's son William, born 3 months after his father's death, grew up hearing stories carefully edited by his mother, learning about the massacre only after classmates told him in middle school, spending his teenage years trying to reconcile the father, described by his mother, with the thief, described by history. He left Pike County at 18, joined the Army, served in Iraq, came back different, now works as an electrician in Lexington, married with 2 daughters who know their grandfather died but not the details. William determined to break cycles of poverty and poor decisions that killed a man he never met. Rick Morton's daughter, 7 when her father died, was raised by her mother who remarried, who tried to provide stability and normalcy, who couldn't prevent her daughter from developing substance abuse issues in her 20s, overdosing twice, finally achieving sobriety at 32, now counselor at Addiction Treatment Center in Ashland, Kentucky, helping others navigate trauma she understands intimately. Wayne Hensley's 3 children were raised by their mother Angela, who never remarried, who worked 2 jobs to keep them fed and housed, who died at 57 from stress-related heart failure, body worn out from decades of struggling. His oldest son followed his father into theft, served time for burglary, got out, now works sporadically and drinks heavily. His daughter finished community college, became paralegal, moved to Columbus, Ohio, sends money home but rarely visits because Pike County holds too many ghosts. His youngest son joined the military like William Hensley, served in Afghanistan, came back with PTSD that Veterans Services has struggled to treat effectively, currently unemployed, and living with relatives, another life shaped by violence, a generation removed. The pattern repeats across 11 families. Children carrying weight they didn't create, making choices influenced by fathers they barely remember or never met. Some transcending the tragedy, others perpetuating cycles of poverty and poor decisions, all of them aware that their lives were irrevocably altered by October 1979. Post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, substance abuse. The massacre's aftermath rippled through 2 generations, destroying futures that hadn't begun yet, creating trauma that inheritance that no amount of therapy or time fully heals. 45 years have passed since that October in the Kentucky mountains. Pike County has changed in some ways, remained stubbornly the same in others. The coal industry that sustained the region for a century is effectively dead. Occasional surface mines still operating, but employing dozens instead of thousands, leaving behind poisoned water, destroyed mountains, communities with no economic base. Unemployment remains high, poverty rates among the worst in the nation, opioid epidemic hitting Appalachia harder than most regions because pain medication offered temporary escape from circumstances that never improved. Young people still leave, population aging and declining, schools consolidating, hospitals closing, the slow death of rural America playing out in real time in hollers where families have lived for 200 years. But some things persist. Mountain codes about respect, about protecting what's yours, about settling debts personally when law can't or won't help. Those codes have evolved, softened in some ways, but they haven't disappeared. Violence still erupts occasionally, still follows familiar patterns of theft and response, confrontation and escalation, though rarely reaching the scale of the Carson massacre, partly because law enforcement presence has increased, partly because cell phones make isolation harder, mostly because the Carson story serves as cautionary tale about where old codes lead when followed to their logical conclusion. Retired Kentucky State Police Captain Frank Morrison, who investigated the massacre, gave an interview in 2020, 41 years after the events, reflecting on what it meant and what lessons, if any, could be drawn. He was 83 years old, living in Lexington, health failing, but mind sharp. He said the following in that interview: Words worth preserving because they encapsulate the moral complexity that makes the Carson massacre endlessly disturbing and impossible to forget. Legally, James Carson was a mass murderer. He eliminated 11 people with premeditation and planning, some while they slept or surrendered, without trial, without mercy, without legal justification. There's no ambiguity there, but morally, it's more complicated. Carson was a man who'd been stripped of everything except one asset, his family's ginseng beds, 40 years of work, and when that was stolen and law couldn't help, he responded according to codes that made sense in his world, even if they horrified ours. Does that justify 11 deaths? Absolutely not. But does it help us understand them? Yes. And understanding doesn't mean forgiving, but it might mean acknowledging that broken systems create their own monsters, that pushing people far enough eliminates the space between civilization and savagery, that sometimes the line between protecting what's yours and becoming what you fear disappears entirely. The story became legend in Appalachia, cautionary tale told to teach lessons nobody could quite articulate. Don't steal from desperate men because you don't know how far they'll go. Don't underestimate what ordinary people will do when pushed beyond their limits. Don't mistake silence for acceptance or patience for weakness. The Carson massacre, that's what they called it, ignoring that 11 Hensley crew members died too, became shorthand for the point where honor becomes horror, where justice becomes vengeance, where protecting family destroys families. Local historians documented it, academic papers analyzed it, true crime podcasts covered it, each retelling slightly different, emphasizing different aspects, but all grappling with the same central question that defies easy answers. Was James Carson a murderer? Yes. 11 counts, premeditated, executed with military precision, killing some victims who posed no immediate threat, showing no mercy to men who surrendered. Was he also a desperate father protecting his family's only legacy in a system that offered no legal protection for what he valued most? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing part of this story because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do in his place? How far would we go to protect something that represents our family's identity, our only inheritance, our connection to ancestors who walked these same mountains before us? Does justice exist when the system has completely failed to recognize or protect what we value? Is there a line between righteous anger and unforgivable violence? Or do extreme circumstances erase that line entirely, leaving only choices that seem reasonable in the moment but monstrous in retrospect? James Carson crossed a boundary no human being should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where a man's life work could disappear overnight, where law enforcement was too understaffed to help, where theft of heritage had no legal remedy because heritage isn't recognized as property, where mountain codes said you settled your own debts because nobody else would, where honor mattered more than law, because law had never protected people like James Carson. There's no easy answer here, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion, where good triumphs and evil is punished. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create desperate people. And sometimes the line between protecting your family and becoming a monster becomes so thin, it disappears entirely, leaving only corpses and questions and children who grow up without fathers on both sides of a massacre that solved nothing and destroyed everything. The Carson homestead is gone now, reclaimed by forest, the ginseng beds destroyed, the knowledge lost, the legacy that was worth 11 lives reduced to ruins and memories that younger generations barely recognize. The Hensley property is an empty clearing where locals won't build because of what the ground remembers. Pike County's population continues declining, young people leaving, old people staying and forgetting, because that's what humans do. We forget, we move on, we cover scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. Almost. There's no memorial in Pike County, no plaque, no historical marker explaining that this was the site of one of Appalachia's deadliest massacres. The county just moved on the way places do. Children playing in forests where men once hunted each other, families living in trailers near where blood once soaked the ground. Life continuing relentless and forgetful despite everything. Because the truth about revenge is this: it doesn't bring back what was stolen. It doesn't heal wounds or restore lost innocence or make anything right. It only creates new wounds, new loss, new families destroyed. James Carson eliminated 11 threats to his legacy, and in the process ensured that legacy would die with him, that his sons would spend their best years in cages, that his family name would become synonymous with murder, rather than the stewardship he'd valued above life itself. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. At what point does protecting what we love transform us into the very thing we're fighting against? If this story made you think about justice, legacy, and the price we pay when systems fail and old codes collide with modern law, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about honor and violence, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when pushed to the edge. Comment below. Where do you draw the line between protecting what's yours and losing your humanity in the process? What would you have done in James Carson's position? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now somewhere with different people, facing the same impossible choices in forgotten corners, where the system has failed and desperation takes hold. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the fundamental question remains: what are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One stolen root, one broken code, one desperate October night at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not in law books, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from.